I want you all to take a little journey with me to begin this. And I want you to try and recall those feelings of the first day of school, whether that's for you elementary school, first grade, when you were a young child, and those feelings of excitement on the first day of school. Perhaps it's a mixture of excitement, trepidation, fear, anxiety, all of the above. Maybe you just spent an entire summer playing outside. Remember when kids used to do that? Like actually do things outside? Mom would not come looking for me. I'd be out for 6, 7 hours. She's, he'll come home, it's fine. Be considered child abuse these days in some regards. But after a summer of playing outside and enjoying friendships, it's back to the hallowed halls. And I remember showing up for the first day of school with my new haircut, my Velcro shoes, my Space Invaders t-shirt, because I was rocking the arcade all summer long. And one of the best things, of course, is to see some of your best friends. Like, what's up, Sean? What's up, Doug? How are you guys? Like, we're good. We just saw you yesterday. Like, did you guys see the new Star Wars movie? Did you? This kid, he was so excited about Star Wars. Did you see Empire Strikes Back? We totally saw Empire Strikes Back. Can you believe Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad? Spoiler alert, I realized there might be people here who have not seen Star Wars. I actually do know 2 people in my life. So if you're watching this, my bad. Anyway, Darth Vader's his dad. I remember the excitement at school reaching sort of this fever pitch when my friends told me, they said, dude, do you know we're going to get free food today? I didn't know this was a thing in school. They said, we're going to get free food. Like, lunch is free. It's like, what do you mean lunch? Yes, every single day we're here, we're getting free food. The only thing that possibly could have been better is if I ran to the lunchroom and the Lucky Charms elf was like, oh, you got all the things there for free. Of course, I'm thinking in my mind, the Lucky Charms elf is going to be there. He wasn't there. But as the lunch bell rang and the 3 of us were just running excitedly to see what all this free food was about, no elf there, but there was a lunch lady. So I'm standing in line, and I've got my tray was not ready because she handed the tray, but I'm looking at all the options, and I'm like, okay, let's see, what do they have here? They've got pizza, pizza rolls, buttered rolls without pizza, mac and cheese, grilled cheese, milk. It was basically like there should have just been a neon sign that said cheese. That's how it felt to me. Now you would think for the average American kid, that is heaven. But for me, I remember looking at the lunch lady and saying, excuse me, lunch lady? Hi, ma'am, hi. Do you have anything that doesn't have milk or cheese in it? And I remember her looking at me and going like, no, weirdo. The look on her face was just looking at me like I'm an alien speaking, I'm this crazy kid. So without my consent, she put a pizza roll and a half pint of cow's milk on my tray and sent me on my way. Now, that pizza roll and that half pint of milk was going in one of 3 places. It was either going to go in my friend Sean's stomach, which was pretty common. It was going to go in the trash, or on the rare occasion when I felt enough peer pressure, I would actually drink the milk or eat the cheese and get violently ill. You see, I was born lactose intolerant, been lactose intolerant my whole life, which means I'm not able to digest cow's milk, goat's milk, any mammalian milk that has lactose in it. And this is a really interesting thing because for me, growing up in a lower income family in the city of Detroit, having those free lunches was something that for my family and so many other families growing up in a city that had so many economic issues, which continue to this day, for many, many families, that's a critical part of getting the nutrition into these children's bodies. So it was going to add additional strain and pressure on our already fragile situation, being in Detroit, being in a low-income family, being raised by a single mom who was working 3 jobs at a time just to make ends meet. It meant that she had to pack my lunches and adding already more expense to our fragile financial situation. So for kids in the school lunch program, the national school lunch program, many of which are lactose intolerant, this represents a very critical issue. Statistics show that, much like me, on my mom's side, Polish, Italian, and Ashkenazi Jew, and on my dad's side, Puerto Rican and Spanish. If we look at the stats, 80 to 85% of people of Black or Latinx heritage are lactose intolerant. Up to 90% of people of Asian lineage, lactose intolerant, and 80% of indigenous Americans. Now, this represents a huge portion of the human population. Now, when we get into why lactose intolerance is an often overlooked issue, especially in the National School Lunch Program, which is what we're going to focus on today, we get into the dynamics of lactose and what it does to the human body. So for me, whenever I would consume under those peer pressure moments, going to Baskin Robbins and friends, I knew it was going to make me sick. I knew that trying to digest, which my body couldn't rather, lactose was going to cause issues like bloating, stomach cramps, diarrhea, vomiting, headaches, nausea, or in more serious cases, contribute to respiratory issues like asthma. And we see this again in BIPOC populations. We see this with kids all the time. I remember having lactose intolerant friends, and we would just talk about all the time how much it felt like we were getting stabbed in the stomach after we'd go have that ice cream. But here's the thing, back in the 70s and 80s when I was a little kid, there was no oat milk ice cream at Ben & Jerry's. Yeah, we had two options, okay? When my mom was packing lunches, there was soy milk and there was rice milk, right? Like all y'all knew vegans with pistachio milk and walnut milk and hazelnut milk and potato milk. Like, y'all knew vegans. You don't know how hard it was back in the day as an OG. As an OG, it was soy milk, rice milk. Not sexy. It was tough. And of course, the kids would bully me because they're like, what's your brown milk? That's gross. Easy now, easier. But some things never change. You see, with lactose intolerance being such a pervasive issue in communities of color and children of color, in particular in the National School Lunch Program, I want to give you a scope of the issue that we're facing here and how rampant this is and why I want to focus on this talk today. See, in the National School Lunch Program, which is a federally funded program that I'll get into history today, there are currently 30 million children every single year that are enrolled in our public school system that benefit from this program in over 100,000 public schools. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the trouble with this is that these children, in many cases, will rely on their daily lunches for 47% of their caloric intake. Now, for a lactose-intolerant child like me and millions of other, if they're not getting that protein, they're not getting those macronutrients, they're not getting that calcium, and they're being given things like pizza rolls and cow's milk they can't digest, again, that puts additional pressure on parents of low-income, underprivileged families to provide those calories. It's straining an already vulnerable part of our population. Now, I want to get into some of the deeper aspects of what I like to call dietary racism. Now, when we talk about racism, quite often food is not necessarily part of the conversation. But if we think about the roots of the National School Lunch Program and the persistent, pernicious elements of not providing the children with the nutrition they need and the foods they can actually digest and assimilate, it is a subtle form of dietary racism when you have a history of white European lawmakers, mostly white men, making decisions for BIPOC populations, not understanding how it affects their health, how it affects their wellness, how it affects their financial stability. And this goes way back. It goes all the way back to actually before World War II. And what was happening in the US, even prior to our engagement in World War II, is we started to have a surplus of dairy products, in particular milk and cheese. And this surplus, this actually started in the 1930s, got to be so voluminous, that it was driving this surplus where the price of milk and the price of cheese was plummeting to where dairy farmers were going to the federal government saying, we need help here. Like, we can literally not afford to survive. And then, of course, our engagement with the Allies in World War II started to ramp up the production of milk and dairy even more, to the point of all of these propaganda pieces. These are actual posters and actual, you see those propaganda pieces with You remember like the We Can Do It with Rosie the Riveter? These were all things that were posted publicly to say, look, we need to get dairy production going because they were sending dry skim milk and canned condensed milk overseas for the American soldiers. Well, of course, we won the war, the Allies won, but dairy production didn't cease. It kept going and going and going. And in 1940, the National Dairy Act was passed, and also the Works Progress Administration was created to figure out ways to get the demand for milk going with the American public. Well, the soldiers came back, the baby boom started, everyone's just like, we won the war, let's make love and make babies. Well, the thing was, adults didn't really want the milk. So by 1946, June 4th, 1946 to be exact, President Harry Truman signed the National School Lunch Act into law. And what this did basically was people were going to Harry Truman and being like, oh, nobody wants milk, what should we do? And Harry Truman, I have no idea if this is a great impression of Harry Truman, didn't get that far, but he was just like, let's feed it to the kids. So they began a program which I think in some ways was a noble effort. I want to give them a little bit of credit. Kids need nutrition. There's a booming population that's happening in the country now. Let's provide lower income, underprivileged families in our public school systems access to low cost or free lunches. But really, underneath it was, we need to funnel all this dairy somewhere, so let's put it in the kids' bellies. So it was signed into law in 1946, which mandated that 1.5 to 2 pints of milk be placed on the trays of American school kids every single day. And initially, it was that the federal government would cover half the costs and the states or the schools themselves would cover the other half. Well, as production continued to increase, the dairy industry needed some protections. And they went back to the federal government and said, great, you've got the National School Lunch Act, we're gonna start putting the milk and the cheese into the kids' bellies, whether it makes them sick or not, which they didn't have any real reality around that. But what happened was a system of subsidies were created. And the system of subsidies were basically coming from, anybody want to guess where the revenue came for these subsidies? You get one guess. It rhymes with anaphylaxis. Taxes! Yes! Taxes. Free lunch ain't exactly free, right? So since the 1940s, we, as the American taxpayers, whether you're vegan or you're carnivore or whatever you identify as, our money has gone to create a system of subsidies. In fact, if we fast forward to 1977 and President Jimmy Carter, he actually allocated $2 billion in taxpayer subsidies over the next 4 years. Now, what did this do? This created an even further glut of dairy products, to the point that, if you've heard of the term government cheese, as this huge surplus of milk is starting to rot in these storage facilities, they would homogenize it into butter and into cheese products and store them in underground or above ground facilities in 35 different states. And in 1982, the New York Times had an expose that came out that said all of this government cheese, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, gallons of milk. In 82, this is 40 years ago now, when I was having my school lunch revelation, same year, it was costing between $40 and $50 million each year to store the cheese and another $40 to $50 million to transport it. It's an egregious, egregious waste of resources. Now, if we look at today, if we look at subsidies and we go back to our taxpayer burden, the meat and the dairy industries, the recent statistics said that up to 73% of the revenue that is bolstering the meat and dairy industry come from subsidies. These industries would literally not exist in their current form if it was not for government subsidies and our taxpayer dollars. They would collapse. So as things went on, there were two organizations that were created. Dairy Management, Inc., which was in charge of basically managing the supply, the production, getting the actual fluid milk and the cheese and the homogenized butter into consumers' hands. And the second organization that was created was called MilkPEP, which was the marketing and advertising arm of the dairy industry, who command to this day around a $350 million annual marketing budget. Now, in the early 90s, they thought, okay, we've got all this surplus still of dairy products. How do we get an association that milk is good for you, that it builds strong bones? Well, they came out with one of the most famous advertising campaigns of all time, Got Milk. Milk does a body good. And when you have $350 million in a marketing budget, you can pay every millionaire athlete and celebrity under the sun. And I mean, this is just a sampling from the 90s of the ads. I mean, if you look at the roster of people they've paid over the years, it's unbelievable. It's a who's who of Hollywood and professional athletes, further cementing this idea to BIPOC populations that if you consume milk and dairy like Shaquille, like Michael Strahan, Dennis Rodman, Batman, Albert Pujols, Tyra Banks, the Williams sisters, Oscar de la Hoya, even though these populations are traditionally lactose intolerant, be like your heroes. They drink milk. They're millionaires. They're professionals. I mean, you can see how pernicious this kind of advertising is to convince children and young adults to consume a product that makes them sick, that puts them at a learning disadvantage because they want so desperately to be like their heroes. Now, another layer of this was in, I know, Donald Trump's made an appearance twice. I know, you're welcome. In the early 1990s, MilkPEP and the dairy industry got together with the billion-dollar fast food corporations because there's still too much dairy and cheese out there. Now, what did they do? They decided to create new products on the fast food level where they're putting even more cheese and more milk into the consumer marketplace. So what did they do? They created things like the Pizza Hut stuffed crust pizza, like the Quadralupa quesadilla at Taco Bell. I mean, think about it. It just sounds not good. Quadralupa. Cheese upon cheese upon cheese upon cheese. I show this because you can look this up on YouTube. The very first television advertising campaign for stuffed crust pizza was with Donald and Ivana Trump. Look it up on YouTube. It's hilarious in a very frightening way. It's like, yes, I'd like a stuffed crust pizza with a side of cringe. It's cringy, even for Trump. So, essentially, what we have here in common in these roots of dietary racism are, again, mostly white male lawmakers, congresspeople, leaders, corporate executives making decisions with no consciousness of how it's affecting people of color, trying to market it to them, get it into their consciousness that this is a food that's healthy for them, that grows strong bones, helps them be successful. And I want to go back really quickly and wrap this up briefly to the National School Lunch Program as sort of the anchor point of this discussion and the roots of the dietary racism that start in childhood. So currently in the National School Lunch Program, there's a reimbursement rate, which is the only way this works. So for every half pint of milk that they give away in the National School Lunch Program, the schools are reimbursed 20.5 cents per half pint of milk. Now, what that means is if 90% of school lunches in the last school year were given milk, our federal government, just on school milk, spent $2.1 billion. Now, the scary part of this is the USDA did an analysis in 2019 that showed that 29% of school milk, all school milk throughout the United States, is thrown away untouched and unopened, to the tune of over $300 million of wasted cow's milk. This is one of, among many, the most wasteful, inefficient programs in our government history, and there are a lot to choose from. We don't need to go down that road. So the trick here is that cow's milk is the only fluid beverage that is currently reimbursed by the federal government. Well, at Switch4Good, the organization I work for, we had a group of lobbyists, scientists, researchers, experts, that in 2020 got the USDA to recognize and acknowledge soy milk as a nutritional equivalent to cow's milk. Now that was a huge victory, nutritional equivalency, right? Has the same macronutrient profile, same level of protein, calcium, B vitamins, D, great. But nutritional equivalency is not the same as cafeteria availability or distribution. So what we proposed and what we are proposing is that soy milk be included in the national school lunch program at the same reimbursement rate as cow's milk. So what we did recently is we got together and decided to petition and write a letter to Secretary of the USDA, Mr. Tom Vilsack. Tom Vilsack has been the USDA Secretary for 2 different presidential terms and also used to be the head of the US Dairy Council. So you can see the uphill battle we've been facing around this. What we did recently is we got 31 congresspeople, including the entire Congressional Black Caucus led by Troy Carter, members of the Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus, the support of the National Urban League, Reverend Al Sharpton, the NAACP, and other social justice organizations, to craft a letter to Secretary Vilsack saying, this is the scope of the problem with hundreds of millions of children, tens of millions rather, who do not have the ability to digest cow's milk, who are at a disadvantage with their learning, who have their health compromised. We want you to offer soy milk at the exact same reimbursement rate in the National School Lunch Program to all the kids that need it most. We delivered this letter actually last week. So we are waiting to see how Secretary Vilsack responds to this, but we have more support than ever over this initiative. And we're very, very hopeful about his response to this. Because we see a world where we think all children deserve to be on a level playing field in terms of their nutrition, their wellness, their ability to learn without having their health, and their ability to achieve at the level of their white peers. We want to level that playing field, and we really do that. Feel that it starts with food justice and having the availability of a plant-based milk that is nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk available to every American child in the National School Lunch Program, in particular, children of color who are at an economic disadvantage. And of course, I would be remiss to mention the animals in this equation. There are over 9 million dairy cows in the United States that are forcibly impregnated, that are subjugated against their will to produce milk over and over and over again, to have their babies stolen from them and be turned, in terms of male calves, into veal. To think about what these cows go through to produce millions of gallons of milk that are wasted every year is a travesty. It's horrifically wasteful of life. It's disrespectful to our nation's children of color. It's putting these animals through unnecessary cruelty and subjugating them to a life of enslavement and overproduction. And the reason that I'm so passionate about this, not only because I remember feeling subjugated as a child, a lactose-intolerant child, but as I became vegan 24 years ago and learned about the plight of these beautiful animals to me, it made me realize that part of my mission is to try and protect the 2 most vulnerable beings in our population, children and animals. And I want to leave you today with 2 quotes from Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela that I think sum up the core of the spirit of this issue for me. Nelson Mandela said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way it treats its children." And Mahatma Gandhi said, "The greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. I hold that the more helpless a creature, the more entitled it is to protection by man from the cruelty of humankind." I believe, and the entire team at Switch4Good believes, that we will see a world, hopefully in our lifetimes, where we remove racism from our plates. We remove racism from our governmental policies. We have more justice in the food industry, justice for our children. And I think as we eliminate racism, hopefully someday, we can also eliminate speciesism from that conversation as well. Thank you so much.